So in a few hours, as I am saying this, the election of 2024 will begin. I'm doing this podcast on Monday evening, and I wanted to address a couple of important issues that people don't seem to know about in terms of how a presidential election in the United States works. In particular, there are a couple of loopholes where I think it is possible to legally cheat in this election. And I'm not talking about either candidate, but the big question that has been on my mind and on many people's minds, is it possible to quote unquote legally cheat in an election?
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
I'm not talking about will the Democrats cheat, will the Republicans cheat. I am not talking about whether they could rig an election machine or more people vote than are living, all these kinds of like what you think of when you think of election cheating. I am talking about legal cheating, meaning does the Constitution provide a way for one party to change the results of an election to support their party? And again, I'm not talking about Republicans doing this. I'm not talking about Democrats doing this. I'm talking about, does the Constitution of the United States of America allow for somehow the results of the election to change after the fact? And in order to understand this, we have to understand how the election is actually. And by the way, when we were figuring out how to title this podcast, we're a little nervous. Like Jay and I were talking earlier, and can we call this podcast How to Cheat in an Election? Well, I'm afraid if we call it that, maybe we get banned from different social media platforms, not understanding what we're really talking about. We're just trying to educate people on kind of the loopholes and the intricacies that at least I have found in the Constitution of the United States of America. It's very interesting because there were a lot of things I did not realize, and now I sort of do. I don't think anybody fully does, which is why there are still issues being fought in the Supreme Court to this day. But it's so interesting, and I'm going to tell you, it is legally possible to cheat in the U.S. election according to the Constitution. But first, we got to take a step back, and there's some subtleties to really understand about how the U.S. does elections. And even if you think you know about the Electoral College or the popular vote, I can guarantee you probably don't know everything that you need to know. So first off, why don't we have a popular vote? And we did a podcast about this a few months ago. And the more I think about it, the more annoyed I am. Because, look, the founders of the United States of America agreed on an electoral college for a particular reason. By the way, many countries, they don't have a direct democracy, which means everybody just votes for president. And they don't have an electoral college, but they have what's called a parliamentary system. So a parliamentary system, if it was in the U.S., it would mean Congress would vote for the president. In other words, if Congress votes for the president, then the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, would be president of the United States, or previously Nancy Pelosi would have been president of the United States. If the U.S. was a parliamentary system, that's what it would have happened. The people vote in their districts for a congressman, and then that congressman casts one vote to see who would be the leader of the United States, and that winner, which would be the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, he would become the president. Note, I said the House and not the Senate. In a parliamentary system, the House is representative of the people, and the Senate is sort of more representative of the states or pieces of the country that make up the country. Note that each state in the Senate has exactly 2 senators. It doesn't matter if you're Wyoming, that has very few people living in it, or New York, that has 20 million people living in it. Every state has 2 senators, so it's not as representative of the public. The House of Representatives, each district is determined by population, by the census. So it's more representative it's more close to a popular vote than the Senate is. So that's why in a parliamentary system, Congress, that looks like the House of Representatives, that votes for the leader of the country. So obviously the founders of the Constitution said, no way, we don't want a parliamentary system. We just broke free from England. We don't want to have the same political system they have. Also, another problem with the parliamentary system, and, again, the idea that members of Congress pick the president, is that it doesn't really count for separation of powers as much. The Constitution is all about How do we separate the three branches of government, the legislative, judicial, and executive? So the president will be too reliant on pleasing the legislative branch, aka Congress, and so would always be kissing up to them so that they would vote for him or her to be president. So we really didn't want a congressional or parliamentary system. The other thing is, it's a little easier for foreign interference in a pure congressional system. A country can basically bribe members of Congress and the Senate over the years that those people are in office, the senators and congressmen are in office, than it would be in an electoral college system, which I'll describe in a second. Again, the popular vote is considered direct democracy. Some countries do it, but it doesn't really work here in the US, and I'll describe why. So again, popular vote is you have one big national vote. Whoever gets the most votes becomes president. Only 5 times in US history has the president of the United States lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. I'll give you a second to just think about it. What are the 5 times? Now, obviously, 2016, Trump lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton by about 2 million votes, but won the Electoral College by almost a landslide. And the time before that was in 2000 with Bush Gore. Gore won the popular vote, and Bush won the Electoral College, but just by 579 votes in Florida. And we'll discuss that in a little bit because there was the Supreme Court got involved and it was the Electoral College is related. So Bush did not win the popular vote, but he won the election because he won the Electoral College. And by the way, when they finally did do all the recounts, he did legitimately win Florida. He did legitimately win the Electoral College. He was legitimately president of the United States. And before that, there was 1876. Rutherford B. Hayes lost to Samuel Tilden in the popular vote and then basically did some deals and won the Electoral College. So that was a very weird election. And Benjamin Harrison, he was the grandson of a president, interestingly, but he lost the popular vote, won the Electoral College. And 1824, which is a very important election constitutionally, Andrew Jackson won the popular vote. Andrew Jackson won the Electoral College, and he still lost the election to John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. So how can that happen? Well, there were 4 candidates for president, and it's not the person who wins the most electors wins, and this is crucial for the later part of this. It's not the person with the most electors that wins in the Electoral College. That's called a plurality when you get the most, but you have to win a majority. So there were 4 candidates, and they kind of all got about a quarter. Andrew Jackson got a little bit more than a quarter. So he won the Electoral College, but he did not win the majority. So it was thrown into the House, and the House picked John Quincy Adams. A lot of people thought it was unfair because the theory was John Quincy Adams told Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House, a very influential House member, hey, I'll make you Secretary of State. You throw all your votes to me. And then John Quincy Adams got elected by the House. So if no candidate wins a majority of the Electoral College, then the House of Representatives selects the president and the Senate selects the vice president. There's one more rule, which is the House of Representatives doesn't select the president one vote at a time. Like what happens is each state delegation meets, then the congressman from that state vote, and then each state casts one vote in the House of Representatives, and that's what selects the president. A majority selects the president. So that's a basic summary of what happens, but it's important to know also the vice president is selected by the Senate. Note that, again, this is designed to combine a parliamentary system with a popular vote system. The House, again, representing closer to a popular vote system, the Senate representing close to a more republic style of system. And now here's the argument for a popular vote, is that if I'm from Wyoming and you're from New York, my vote is worth more than your vote because no matter what, Wyoming gets at least 3 electors and New York gets 40, but Wyoming is more than 10 times smaller than New York. So each vote in Wyoming counts more towards electing electors than each vote in New York. So is that fair that the voters from small states should have proportionately more power than the voters in very large states? Okay, let's just leave that hanging there. Let me describe the Electoral College just for a second. The Electoral College, basically, it says that when you vote in your state, you are not actually voting for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. It says Kamala Harris or Donald Trump on your ballot, but they're not actually up for election in your state. The presidential election is not one election. It is 51 separate elections, one election in each state and one election in the Washington, D.C. Again, you're not electing a president. What you're doing is you're electing a slate, a bunch of people called electors. There's a bunch of Democrat electors and there's a bunch of Republican electors. And you vote for all the electors simultaneously. So I'm either voting for all the Republican electors or all the Democrat electors. And then the electors on December 17th will vote each in their respective state capitals for who they want to be president. By the way, it's not necessarily the case they have to vote Democrat or Republican, even if they were a Democrat or a Republican elector. I'll get to that in a second. And then once they vote for who they think they should be president, each state sends the results of the electors' choices to the Congress. And on January 6th, famously, the Congress opens the results and declares who the quote-unquote Electoral College picked as president. The Electoral College is not a place. The words Electoral College are not even mentioned in the Constitution. There's no laws that mention Electoral College. It's just what it's called. But again, just to clarify, you're voting for a slate of electors. Those electors then vote for president. And by the way, the number of electors is roughly equal to the number of members in Congress of each state. If you vote for Kamala Harris, if Kamala Harris wins in your state, then all of her electors that were chosen by her or by the Democratic Party in her state are the ones that pick the president in that state. So if you're in Colorado, if Kamala Harris wins a majority of Colorado, all of her electors are the ones who cast their vote for president. Now, on December 17th, when the electors cast their vote, they don't have to vote for Kamala Harris. It's called a faithless elector, and it's happened before, where somebody who's an elector for Kamala Harris or for Donald Trump, they don't have to vote for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Now, in most of the states, I think about 35 of the states, they are required to vote for the person who they were elected to vote for. But in many of the states, about 15 of the states, they don't have to vote. And it's been the case. Like in 2016, after it was clear that Hillary Clinton was going to lose, some of the electors were faithless. They voted for Bernie Sanders. They voted for other people. They voted for Elizabeth Warren. This has never swayed an election. And that's why many states have also made laws requiring electors to vote for who the popular vote says they have to vote for. It could sway an election. I'm not saying this is not a way of cheating. Most states, again, have laws against this. And I really think no state would allow an elector to be so faithless as to sway the results of an election. So let's get rid of that for a second. Again, this is what happens. Tomorrow, November 5th, or today, if you're listening to this, you cast a vote. You're not voting for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. You're voting for the slate of electors that if that candidate wins, that slate has to vote for that candidate, more or less. And then on December 17th, the electors vote. And on January 6th, the Congress, the House of Representatives, but led by the Vice President of the United States, basically certifies that vote. So why have an electoral college? Why not a popular vote? Well, I'll give you a couple of dangerous scenarios. First off, there is a way to win the popular vote in a very odd way. And this is just kind of a mathematical thing. So something like this would never happen, but it just shows you how the popular vote might be unfair. So let's say a candidate wins New York and California. It's a landslide in New York and California by 20% or more in New York and California. They just crush it. But then they lose the other 48 states by just 3%. So again, if you win California and New York by 20% and then lose the other 48 states by just 3%, you could win the popular vote, but you will lose 48 states to 2. And that doesn't seem fair. It means that all of the states, including Texas, Illinois, Michigan, Wyoming, Montana, Ohio, New Jersey, Maine, all the other states could potentially in a popular vote never have any influence in an election. The only two places where a candidate should ever campaign or make promises to are New York and California. And you never have to care about any of the other states if you're president. You only have to care about making the people in New York and California super happy, and you could still win the election every time. So that's one reason why people don't like just a popular vote solution. The other reason that's kind of important is, let's say the national election is really, really close. how do you do a nationwide recount in time for January 20th, or maybe hold another election? Like, it just seems almost impossible. If there's questions of fraud, or if things are very close, you want to make it as local as possible so the problem is only isolated to a small local area, so there's time to do a recount or fix the problem or whatever. So a nationwide recount would be too hard to do. And so that's another reason why a popular vote has not happened. Another reason why is and this is an ugly reason, and is obviously a reason I disagree with and everybody should disagree with. Another reason is slavery. So when the Constitution was written in 1787, but was put into action starting around 1789 or 1788, there was simply more population in the North. So the Southern states thought that the North would instantly vote away slavery, which they would, of course. And the Southern state wanted to feel like that wouldn't happen. So they were very much in favor of the Electoral College. So that's an ugly reason to be against the popular vote and for an Electoral College. By the way, right now, 60% of people prefer a popular vote to Electoral College. But I think they don't really understand the math of that New York and California example that I mentioned before, where it really is possible, not likely, but possible for only 2 states out of 50 to have any influence at all in a presidential election. The Electoral College, while it's smaller, it does allow for a broad representation of people throughout the United States. So kind of the so-called flyover states have more influence. By the way, no other country other than the US does an Electoral College. Everybody who tried an Electoral College got rid of it, usually in favor of direct democracy, a pure vote. But the US still has it. One thing I like about the Electoral College is not only this broad representation, but, I mentioned earlier how a parliamentary system could be influenced by foreign powers. Like maybe, I don't know, Putin could bribe people in Congress. But an Electoral College only exists for like a few weeks. They're elected November 5th, they vote December 17th, and then they're gone. And you don't know who's going to be in the Electoral College until Election Day in November. And then just a few weeks later, they make their vote and they're gone. It's much harder, I should say, to influence. And it also doesn't make the president rely on a specific group of people like Congress. He doesn't have to kiss ass to the electors. All these electors have to vote for him or her. So I'll mention there's been many attempts, but there was one almost attempt to get this changed. In order to make a popular vote now, you have to make a constitutional amendment. You can't just make a law, because this is in Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution. You have to change the Constitution with a constitutional amendment. In order to make a constitutional amendment, as opposed to a law, you need 2/3 of the House and Senate to vote for it, as opposed to just 50.1%. And you need 3/4 of the state legislatures to vote for it. Obviously, 48 states have no incentive to change this from Electoral College to a popular vote. So this will never be a constitutional amendment. But in 1969, Senator Birch Bayh led a push. He proposed in the House, or he got someone to propose in the House, for a constitutional amendment to change the election. The House, it was a landslide. The House voted 339 to 70 to request the states consider this constitutional amendment, but the Senate didn't even look at the law, so it never got passed. By the way, just a footnote about Senator Birch Bayh. In 1980, on my birthday, I was turning 12 years old, and my father took me to Washington, D.C. for my first trip there, and it was Senator Birch Bayh's birthday as well. And so I went to his office, and his office was very kind to me. I was a 12-year-old kid. They brought out a cake, and they sang happy birthday to both of us, and my moment in the sun on Capitol Hill. Anyway, here is the issue. I'm going to talk about 2 issues whereby I think someone can cheat. Oh, by the way, I just want to mention, in the Electoral College, this is very important, it's 48 of the states have winner take all. Even if I only win 51% of the votes in Colorado, I get 100% of the electors. So 48 states have a winner take all for the slate of electors that they send to the Electoral College. But 2 aren't, Maine and Nebraska. It's a combination of winner take all, gets some of the electoral votes, and also each congressional district votes for an elector. So it makes a small difference, but who knows? It could make the difference of an election. Now, again, if nobody wins a majority of the electoral votes, then it goes into the House to pick the presidency and the Senate for the vice presidency. That could only occur in this election if it's a tie, 270 to 270. Now, I said 270. How many electors do you need to win the election? Well, there's 538 electors. That's how many people on November 5th we elect to the Electoral College. And 269 to 269 is a tie. And if you get 270, you win the presidency. And this is not quite accurate according to the Constitution, but everyone says this. Like the Secretary of State of Alabama has an FAQ about the election. And one of the questions was, how many electors does a person need to win the presidency? And it specifically says 270. This is not true. And many states say this on their FAQs about the election. And I've seen many articles in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, on both left and right websites. You need 270 electoral votes to win the election. This is not true. And this is the biggest possibility for cheating. Here's what you need. You need a majority of the electors. Well, you can say, you just said there's 538 electors. 269 is a tie. So 270 is a majority. Yes, that's true. If 538 electors are elected and sent to the Electoral College, that is true. So, couple things to mention. And how does someone get to be an elector? Well, right now, you're elected an elector if the majority of your state votes for you. But it wasn't always the case. And by the way, this is not what the Constitution says. The Constitution actually says the state legislature is 100% in charge of who the electors are that go from your state to the Electoral College to then elect a president on December 17th when the Electoral College votes. So if I'm the state House of Representatives of Georgia, for instance, or Colorado or Maine or whatever, I can say, you know what? We're just going to pick the electors by lottery. We're going to make a law where we're going to put everybody who lives in Colorado in a big basket, and we're going to pull out 13 names or however many people are electors from Colorado, and those are going to be the electors. We're not going to have a vote. We're just going to do it by lottery. That actually is a legal method that the state legislatures can choose to select their electors. It doesn't have to be by a popular vote. In fact, in the first presidential races, like in the early 1800s, it was about half and half whether states used the popular vote or not. Now, ever since 1868, all the electors, each election has been chosen by popular vote, but that's because the state legislature of each state made a law saying that the electors have to be chosen in that state by popular vote. Now, notice 48 states made it winner take all, but 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, their state legislature voted, we don't want it to be winner take all. We're going to make it this way. Congressional districts get an elector, and then the state as a whole gets electors. So they made their own laws. And this was very important to note, that this was a state-by-state way of choosing the electors from that state. So let's get to the heart of it now. And then the state legislature is the body of people who certify, here's who the electors are. They have to do this by December 8th this year. We're telling Washington, D.C., we're telling the Capitol, here's who our electors are. And then on December 17th, we're going to vote with those electors, and then we're going to send the results of the votes to you. So again, it has nothing to do with the popular vote. It has nothing to do with the Constitution. It's just by law in each state individually. And again, this only started around 1868, where all the states chose their electors via popular vote. But again, I will remind you, and this is critical for the cheating I am about to get to, the possible cheating. In the Constitution, the state legislatures have 100% of the power to pick the electors of that state. The Constitution does not mention the popular vote at all. Now, what could that mean? Well, it could mean that, let's say, a state votes red, but the state legislature is blue, meaning the state House of Representatives has a majority of Democrats over Republicans. Even if the state votes for a Republican candidate, the state legislature, again, according to the Constitution, can technically say, hey, we hear you, popular vote, but we're going to send a Democrat slate of electors instead. Now, this has never happened, but it is a potential way, according to the Constitution, for it to happen. Will it happen? No, because there is a little bit of precedent thanks to Bush-Gore 2000. What happened is that when they initially counted the votes in Florida, it looked like Bush won by 1,000. Now they did a little bit of recounting and his count slimmed down to 300. So Gore obviously wanted a bigger recount. And Bush did not want a bigger recount because he was only winning by 300, but it was 300 people out of 300 million people in the United States. But that was big enough for him to say, look, I'm president of the United States. No more recount. And there wasn't any laws that specified in Florida how a recount could or should happen. Gore obviously said, no, we need a recount. And the Florida Supreme Court said, yeah, we agree with Gore. We're going to have a recount. And it went, of course, it was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, you could have a recount if you want next election, but the law in Florida does not say anything about having a recount in this election. So there's no laws or provisioning for a possible recount. In other words, they said, you cannot change state law after the election has already occurred. You could change state law for future elections, but you cannot change state law for the election that just occurred. Now, a lot of people screamed and yelled and said, well, that means Bush might be winning unfairly. Luckily, when they really did do a full recount after the fact, and this was after Bush was already president, Gore had conceded, but they still went ahead and wanted to see who really won. Bush did win officially by 579 votes in Florida. It didn't really matter. It didn't change the election, but it did set a precedent that the states cannot change their laws after the fact. By the way, there's a slight loophole in this decision in that the Supreme Court says we're just making a ruling about this one situation and not in general, but pretty much that set the precedent that states cannot change the laws by which they certify a slate of electors after the election has occurred. Now, since all 50 states have laws saying the slate of electors is chosen by popular vote, the state legislature cannot change the law after the election. It has to be by the popular vote. But there is a loophole to this. There is no timeline by which the state legislature has to send in to Washington, hey, here's who our electors are, and here's how they vote. There's no timeline. I'll use the opposite example. Let's say Florida, for instance, has a Republican state legislature. Let's say Florida votes for Kamala Harris. The popular vote of Florida is for Kamala Harris. Okay, so now it's Kamala Harris. The state has to use the slate of electors that was elected, which is Kamala Harris's electors. And the state legislature could say, fine, we approve, but we're just going to think about it for a few weeks. And they send it in on December 18th. Guess what? It's too late. Once you pass the deadline, then you're out. You opted your state out of that election. And you could think to yourself, this is ridiculous. No state is ever going to do that. Well, there is precedent. So for instance, in 1864, the Civil War was going on. The southern states did not send in their slate of electors. The northern states, which was called the United States, they did not agree that the southern states have conceded. So they waited for their slate of electors, and the slate of electors for the southern states never came in. And those states simply did not vote for the presidency in 1864. By the way, in 1792, or whenever the first election was, New York hadn't gotten their act together to figure out how to ratify a slate of electors. So New York State did not vote in the first election because they never sent in a slate of electors. So there is some precedent for not sending in. Like, it has happened. Now, these are extreme examples, but I'll give you some examples. So for instance, Florida, right now, if you look at all the polls, it looks like Florida is leaning towards Trump and the Florida state legislature is Republican. But if hypothetically Florida went for Kamala, hypothetically, this could happen in Florida. They could say, you know what, we're just not going to send in our electors. And I will explain what happens next in a second. And so they would just opt out of the race if that happened. The Florida voters would not get a chance to vote for president. On the flip side, let's say California votes for the popular voters for Donald Trump. It's almost certainly not going to be. I would say 100% chance it's not going to be for Donald Trump. But let's just say it's for Donald Trump. Kamala supporters could call up the state legislature and say, listen, do not send in that slate of electors. Just wait until December 18th to send it in, and then it's too late. And then California would not vote for Trump. It would not vote for anybody. Now, what happens then? Do you still need 270 electors? No. the number 270 is not written in the law. To win the presidency, you need a majority of the Electoral College. If, for instance, Texas did not send in a slate of electors, Texas has 40 electors out of the 538. The Electoral College would not have 538 electors. It would have 498 electors. And then you would only need 250 electoral votes to win the presidency. And you don't need 270. So any article that says you need 270 electoral votes to win, they're sort of correct, assuming that 538 electors are sent in, but they're not constitutionally correct when they say that. You need half of the electors that are sent in. And so, again, this is a way to cheat. So if one candidate wins the popular vote of a state, but the state legislature delays, because let's say if a Democrat wins Florida or if a Republican wins California, California could say, look, we're not going to send anything in. Or if a Democrat wins Florida, the Republican state legislature could say, oh, we thought it's in the mail. We thought we sent it, but we didn't send it. So people are worried. They're worried either way. It's not going to go to the House. If they're cheating, this could spiral out of control, though. Like, basically, you could only win in the states where you control the state legislature, because both sides will start doing this and it would go crazy. But here's what would actually happen. This has been suggested on both sides as a potential method for cheating. And by the way, this would be a completely legal way to cheat. There is no way constitutionally to avoid it. Now, obviously, it'll go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court could say, well, the law is these are the electors, and, there wasn't a good reason for the state legislature to delay. So you were basically doing election interference by not sending in your slate of electors. They could say that, but there's no law about this. And the Constitution does give the state legislature some discretion on this. So yes, it'll go up to the Supreme Court, probably the side of, whoever doesn't want this to happen would say this is interference, and the Supreme Court would probably agree with that. But again, this is a loophole in the Constitution, and I've seen articles, people are actually worried about this. I see more that people are worried that Republicans will do this. There's another reason too. Like, let's say Florida, a Democrat wins, and the state legislature, and by the way, state legislature is more or less run by the governor. So Ron DeSantis is a Republican. The Florida state legislature is Republican. Let's say they don't send in a blue slate of electors. Well, the blue people were the majority in Florida in my hypothetical scenario. So anybody who's Republican is just never going to get elected again, because the popular vote wanted blue. So basically, everybody's going to lose faith in any Republican candidate because they're not really following the ethos of the law. And Ron DeSantis doesn't want to vote himself out of a job. The Republicans in the state legislature don't want to vote themselves out of the job. So even if there was some giant conspiracy to rig or legally cheat in this election, this is not going to happen. And on top of just the ethics, there's people who want job security. They're not going to vote themselves out of their job. And then there's this potential for the Supreme Court to override it anyway, even though the Supreme Court does not have to override that. That's just, that's a very hypothetical. But that is one legal way to change the results of election. There is another legal way, and this would affect the Republicans more than the Democrats. Trump's been impeached for insurrection in the House. Like after January 6th, you kind of wonder. So Biden was inaugurated on January 20th, 2021. On January 6th, 2021, there was the certification of the Electoral College. And of course, there was the mob attack on Capitol Hill. And you wonder, and everybody wondered this, why between January 6th and January 20th was it so important to impeach Donald Trump for causing that insurrection? I'm not arguing whether he did or didn't. I just want to know, why did they need to impeach him? He only had 14 days left in the office, and the Senate was clearly not going to convict him in those 14 days. In order to throw someone out of office, the House impeaches, and then the Senate convicts, and then the person is thrown out of office. So it's only after those two parts. So why were they so hurried to impeach him when he only had 14 days left in office anyway, and he was probably not going to get convicted by the Senate in those 14 days? It didn't really matter. Well, it turns out it did matter, because after the Civil War, people were worried that maybe someone like Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederates, would somehow run for Congress or Senate or even president in the United States. And so the states passed a new constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment, and specifically, the 14th Amendment basically says that anyone who's ever been impeached for an insurrection, that's an important word, anyone who's ever impeached for an insurrection cannot hold any federal public office again. So it specifically says, and this language is important, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who having previously taken an oath as member of Congress or as an officer of the U.S. or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the U.S. shall have engaged in an insurrection. So what does that mean? It means that all the offices I just mentioned, like you cannot be a senator or representative or elector or hold any office under the U.S. or as an officer of the United States. You can't be any of those things if you have engaged in insurrection. So the fact that they use the word insurrection when they impeach Donald Trump, that's the argument for he cannot be president of the United States. So you can be sure if he is elected president, and again, I am not speaking with any bias, this is what's going to happen. These are facts. Just like if there's election fraud, it's a fact that either side is going to pursue the case. This is what's going to happen, is that if Trump is elected, the Democrats will say, that's fine, you're elected, but you can't be president because you were impeached for insurrection. And you've had some other criminal cases against you, which mention the word insurrection. And Colorado, the state of Colorado, and Maine did this as well, actually took Donald Trump's name off of the ballot because they said, the state Supreme Court said, look, guys, it says in the Constitution, if you're convicted or if you've engaged in any insurrection and the House of Representatives said Donald Trump engaged in insurrection, you can't be president. So we're taking him off the ballot for president of the United States. The Colorado Supreme Court said this was fine. The Supreme Court stepped in and said, no. You are a state. You cannot have anything to do with the election of a federal official. And president of the United States is a federal position and not a state position. So Colorado was forced to put Donald Trump's name back on the ballot. Note, the Supreme Court did not say anything about insurrection. They just said that the state does not have power to remove anybody from a presidential ballot because a presidential ballot is not a state office, it's a federal. But now Donald Trump's argument, I'm just saying as lawyers, his argument is that he's not an officer of the United States. He's not on the list of people mentioned in the 14th Amendment. Again, the Supreme Court is going to have to decide, who knows? But my guess is it's going to be politically very unpopular for the Democrats to take that all away and fight it in the Supreme Court. And here's the other thing. Let's say they win. And let's say Donald Trump wins the election, but then because of the 14th Amendment, which again was really made just to stop people who fought for the South in the Civil War, it was to stop them correctly from becoming president of the United States again, or a congressman or a senator. So let's say Donald Trump is no longer going to become president because of this. Well, what happens according to the Constitution? The Constitution specifically says if the president-elect, i.e. the person who was elected president, the president-elect cannot assume the office of the presidency, then the vice president-elect will assume the office of the presidency. The vice president-elect is J.D. Vance. So let's say they do something to get rid of J.D. Vance. Well, next in line to become president is the Speaker of the House, although it will be determined in the election happening on November 5th. The Speaker of the House is almost certainly going to be Mike Johnson, who is the current Speaker of the House, who's a Republican. And my guess is what Mike Johnson would do is he would appoint Donald Trump as vice president and then resign from office immediately. Donald Trump will be president, and then they would have to impeach and then convict him to remove him from the presidency, which they won't do because the Republicans control the House. So this is another reason why the Democrats won't do it, because it'll be a convoluted way to destroy the faith in our system. And again, correctly or incorrectly, they don't want to do that. I think they shouldn't do that. And I don't think that will happen. So although there are legal ways to cheat, and all of these legal ways might be pursued somewhat, they won't really result in things. So I've seen articles written, this is how Donald Trump could win, this is how Kamala could win. Don't have the state legislatures send in the results in time, or have the state legislators change the results. They can't change the results because, again, that would probably go against the Bush versus Gore U.S. Supreme Court case, meaning you cannot retroactively change the state law about how electors are elected. And also, the precedent it sets, it would ruin whatever party is in power in that state, probably forever. It would destroy the faith in that party forever. It probably would cost Republicans or Democrats future presidential elections if they pursued that method of cheating. Second, I don't think the Democrats, they have said, I've seen it in the New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, CNN, NPR, they have said that they will pursue the 14th Amendment. But at the end of the day, I do not think they will. So you might see articles about these things. You might see all sorts of debates on TV. My advice is to ignore it. I hope you learn a little bit more about why we have an electoral college versus a popular vote. And please share this with anybody concerned about kind of legal cheating after the election takes place. It's possible, but I don't think it will happen. Thanks so much. You feel free to ask me any questions you want. Share this, friends. You can find me at Altucher to ask questions. And I hope you all have a safe election.